I started to recognize like this aliveness, like pulsating through all of creation. And that idea of, the body of Christ, shifting from that being like a group of people who believe a certain thing to literally the entire universe is the manifested body of Christ. Like that made so much more sense to me. Is like, oh, Christ is this spirit that is animating all things.
And then the wholeness of the whole thing, like you're coming into it with the body now. I actually had a quote I wrote down from your book. You said, prayer is body based. Its purpose is to bring your mind, body, heart, and soul into alignment so that your entire being can be united with God. And that very much gets into, I call the channel Holiness Connection with that little pun going on there of like holiness and then the whole with the WH. And that was my experience too, like with the spiritual journey, that things were more and more integrated. And it's like the psychology of it was not separate from the spirituality of it was not separate from the body. So I'd be curious to hear, more about your experience of that, the prayer of being body based. And then, is it possible, I'm just sort of curious about this part. Is it possible to have more of a continuous prayer experience when we're sort of being more whole with it that way?
Yeah, when I was reading your questions beforehand, I love that you asked like, is this what it means? Because I was like, yes, that's what it means. When the Bible talks about like to pray continuously without ceasing, that used to feel like such a daunting thing. You know what I mean? I'm like, I don't want to be like repeating something in my mind 24 hours a day. Like, because prayer to me was just talking with words to God, so that felt really daunting and impossible. And coming to understand it, as you just described, as this body-based awareness, where essentially I have a chapter in the book. I think it's called "Go into Your Closet and Close the Doors," and it talks about that passage where Jesus is saying, this is how you should pray: go in your closet, close all the doors. And the early church fathers talk about that. Sometimes that is the setting to do this, but what it's actually talking about is the doors being, the five senses, and how, until we bring awareness to those, they're just sort of unconsciously um, externally focused and reacting to the externals of the environment all the time. And so it's like the tail wagging the dog, if there's a loud noise or something disruptive, like I'm reacting to that. If I encounter anything in my environment that kind of disrupts my peace, I'm just, all my life energy is spent kind of reacting to it. And so what that actually means is to like bring your awareness like back into your body, bring all your senses back into this like grounded awareness. And so, in the months after like my experience with on my front porch, I would, like, whatever I was doing, I would try to just be completely aware of whatever it was. Like if I was cooking or something, it's just like I'm stirring this pot, and I might kind of say that, but to be so aware where I'm not even having to say that to myself, I'm just like completely at one with the experience, where to the point where it wasn't even like me, Heather, and the spoon and the pot stirring. It wasn't even like two objects. It was like the whole experience was just merging into one. And starting to identify with that awareness that was in me, which was part of the whole. And so and it's very hard to do, like I'm kind of talking, it was a practice because it's not easy to like get your mind to shut down and to not be thinking about something else, while I'm doing this other thing. So, yeah, the prayer practice was, kind of in every point in my life, trying to just be completely aware of what I was doing. And I my experience of it is when I could do that, my body felt really alive and invigorated, and it was just this heightened sense of awareness, which I found whenever I could be fully in the present moment, there was that like peace that surpassed understanding, um and so that what you kind of said about praying constantly, that's what it came to mean to me, was being aware and fully alive and available to the present moment at all times, which actually like was just such a relief to me, because personally for me, like prayer doesn't usually involve like a lot of thinking and asking or anything like that anymore. It's more of like trying to quiet all my senses until I can kind of just say yes to the present moment and whatever emotions or things that are happening in it. It's like a consenting to what is happening.
Yeah, kind of more of that surrender and consenting to.
Hmm.
And there is such a feeling of freedom in that I've
Hmm.
experienced as well. Like you were saying, it's kind of an unburdening. And then it reminded me too, because the way you were describing it, very much I was talking about the integration of these different aspects of ourselves, but you were even talking about the inner and the outer, and
Hmm.
an integration and wholeness there. There's another part in the book when you write about the stillness point that expanded in the moment and sensing the tonality of different objects in nature. And I was just curious to hear more about that from your perspective. It reminded me about some of the sort of almost experiences where I guess it's from being in the moment and being so present, but it's like there was this sense of timelessness in it that
Yeah.
to me felt like eternity. Like this is what eternity means. I was just curious to hear more of your experience of that.
Yes. That I loved when you wrote that in your questions, but just saying it now. Yeah, that's what I came to understand eternity to be, was really like um this, it's like deeper than time, like time is sort of like this linear measurement that we have, but eternity to me felt more like this fountain, that was rejuvenating in every moment. It was like this creative force that is constantly like coming up and being recycled in every moment. And so yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, no, it's just your experience of that, but it sounds like you're describing it really well. So for you, it felt like this moment of almost an eternal feeling in the moment where
Yeah.
you're so connected with everything. Um,
Yes.
was this almost fountain feeling? You're
Yeah,
saying
yeah,
that's
yeah. Okay,
more
yeah.
what it felt
Sorry, and
like.
you mentioned
Yeah,
nature and all of that. Yeah, and
it's
so
hard to
okay.
describe this stuff, so it's easy to.
Yeah.
But you're
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
describing it very well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that feeling of being in the present moment, like, I feel like I can access it most quickly and easily, like, in nature. I kinda compare it to, like, feeling like the energy of a symphony or something, where, like, when I can still my mind, uh, it's like this, the essential quality that I feel to be me, um, it feels like the same, it feels like it is resonating in harmony with nature. And so, nature is like a place where it can access that feeling of like oneness most quickly. But it was really like an experiential feeling where you're like, oh, this feeling of eternity that I can now recognize animating me is the same thing, the same frequency or energy that I feel when I'm out in nature. And so I started to recognize like this aliveness, like pulsating through all of creation. And that idea of, the body of Christ, shifting from that being like a group of people who believe a certain thing to literally the entire universe is the manifested body of Christ. Like that made so much more sense to me. Is like, oh, Christ is this spirit that is animating all things. And so there was really like this, um, yeah, clarity where, in scripture where it talks about like the rocks crying and, creation singing. And I'm like, that, you know, closer to literally feels like what's happening to me. There is like this beautiful energy that's emanating from all of creation, this aliveness. And then, it's interesting because like part of that spiritual awakening is the recognition of like us all being one, and then also going like, and I'm still Heather, and so there's like going back to the symphony metaphor, figuring out like what is my distinct note that plays in harmony with the rest of creation. And so it's kind of like sometimes a picture that I have is like walking on the shore of an ocean, where you're in the sand, but the waves are coming up and kind of hitting your feet. And a lot of times it's like this practice of kind of straddling between the two, where the ocean might represent, the oneness of everything, but the sand and the shore would represent like the groundedness of my body and my own incarnation. And sometimes, especially like in spiritual communities or whatever, I feel like sometimes there's this infinite emphasis on just getting washed away in the ocean, and it's like when people kind of have these spiritual awakenings, it's like, well, their whole personality just goes away, and there's sort of like a muted quality to them or something, or you know, emotions can't flow because it's like the body's bad, and I don't want to be separate and that kind of thing. And so I'm just swept out to sea versus I think fully being on the shore and feeling totally separate and isolated was my state of awareness before I had my awakening. And now it's like, kind of figuring out how to straddle both of them. I really like listening to Ram Dass talk, but he kind of describes this as like sometimes people forgetting their zip code, like we're all one, but I do have a zip code in which I live, and I have certain responsibilities in my life that are just mine and are still mine to fulfill. And sometimes they're like not glamorous at all. You know what I mean? It's like
Wow.
I got to wake up early and get my kids on the bus and it's cold outside. Like, and I don't really like enjoy that task very much, but it's like being present to these really kind of boring, ordinary, routine things. And that's like, that's a part of Heather. And, a spiritual awakening doesn't eliminate the parts of life that feel like monotonous or
Mm-hmm.
awful, not that getting my kids on the bus is awful, but you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I
Like,
absolutely do.
yeah,
And I think that it reminds me of, I was going to bring it up earlier and then sort of lost the thread of it. Things like spiritual bypass, I think, can come in here too,
yeah,
where sometimes it's not necessarily what people are doing if they're, get a bit lost in the ecstasy and the oneness, but I think it sort of
hmm
can go that direction sometimes.
hmm hmm
Because there are pieces that are part of the whole thing that are the mundane and are the difficult, certainly,
hmm
um, too. So, yeah. And I think, I mean, to me, whenever it's that paradox, it's like I kind of know I'm in the depths and right there. Because
yeah,
it does, so much of this feels paradoxical to our conscious mind. So it feels paradoxical to be one
yes,
and also particular. But yeah, definitely. And so all of this is reminding me of just like one could view this as a particular lens, right? Or Cynthia
hmm
Bourgeois talks about having a different operating system, to use more of like a computer type of a metaphor. And it's reminding me of how, when you initially went into the belly of the whale, it felt like it was hell to you. So
hmm
what do you think? Is this sort of like almost this is heaven? Like the kingdom of heaven is within you. And does that mean potentially, I mean, I never want to box it too hard, but I guess just for the purposes of this discussion, without really trying to box it, does it feel like that's heaven, this other operating system where you do feel that aliveness and connection to the world?
Yeah, I think that is like when Jesus talks about like bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth. So I'm not going to nail this quote precisely, but C.S. Lewis has this quote about essentially heaven being reality itself and hell being a state of consciousness, like a locking up of the mind. And so, that experience that I had where my mind was totally like locked up in fear in this one certain paradigm where I felt separate and alienated from God. It was an internal experience of hell. Um, but it was just my internal perception that was experiencing reality in that way. Like reality had always been the same. The conditions for it had always been the same. Nothing had changed other than my perception. And so, example I use in the book is just about like a caterpillar, going into its cocoon in order to be transformed into a butterfly. And I think like paralleling that to our own like psychological and spiritual transformation, um, like there's nothing wrong or inherently bad about the cocoon. Like it is serving an extremely important purpose in order, for this transformation to have, and for this entity, this insect, which is the caterpillar, to have this new experience of, it's a new experience of the world. It's at a different height. There's new perceptions happening. But you know, that whole process is like encompassed in reality or heaven. It's more about the perception. So like the difference between the caterpillar and us is, there's not this resistance to the cocoon or the transformational process. And so there's this idea that I came across several years ago, to the effect of like reality or yeah, like God is love, and if you are like open and attuned to love, then like reality will feel like heaven, and if you are kind of closed off and fearful to love, then like reality will feel like hell. So I'm not sure if that's like exactly like nailing your question, but it more like heaven had not changed. Like nothing about reality really changed other than my perception and my orientation to it. And so for me, like hell was this necessary stop in the evolution of my consciousness and in my perception. And at that point, once I kind of emerged from the cocoon and could like look down like a butterfly and just see it all for what it was, it's like, oh, now I don't feel resistant to all, the pain that may come up in my life. When I go through something now, and of course this is like an ongoing practice, but I can say that, you know, pre-awakening, my question was always like, why is this happening to me? Like why me? And when's this going to end, et cetera, et cetera. And now when I experience something really painful, it's really not less painful. It's just more of an allowing for the pain to kind of travel through me. And the question kind of more becomes like, what is this revealing about myself? Where do I still have like resistance to life as it is and allowing life in all of its, in all of
Yeah.
its forms and all the experiences to flow through me, and then trying to kind of work to like relax my resistance. So the spiritual practices become more of like really like working on my nervous system, kind
Yeah.
of recognizing like I'm like swallowed up in fear again. Um I can't like snap my fingers and turn it off, but it's like what do I need to do to like relax, or what lie am I telling myself that's making me like clench up and
Yes.
resist all of this, which in turn like just kind of creates and perpetuates more suffering.
Yeah, it sounds like one of your clues that you're in more of that resistant state is sort of a clenching up feeling. And I'll ask you more
Hmm.
if there's other clues you have in a second. But I am very interested in this. Like, in fact, some of my, like, I I have a series called Deep Calling Deep, where I'm exploring sort of connection with other people,
Mhm.
and wanting to put out some offerings around that, where I really mean on that deep level where you're really internally feeling it, and you can also sense it, right? That's where sometimes then you sense the Christ in the other person and the whole thing you were talking about too. There's these sort of deep ways that we interconnect. So I'm curious to hear from me. I'll my biggest clue. I mean, I have it some other times too, but if I'm really not noticing and I happen to encounter a homeless person, that's actually when I notice it the most, because it's really striking to me when I'm in one lens. It's like St. Francis. I want to like go interact with them, and there's this complete opening. And when I'm in the other, maybe I'm still my like person who feels compassion for the homeless person, but it's very different. It's very different in
Mhm.
terms of my own personal, like one-on-one interactional feeling with the person. Um, let's see, I'm getting a little sidetracked there, but so that's sort of one of my clues. So I'd be curious to hear if you have any clues, or if it's mainly the clenching up feeling. But then on the other side of it, when I say the deep calling deep, I always try to emphasize that I'm not talking about boundaries, being
Mhm.
boundaryless. I'm not talking about um, that sort of level, quote unquote, of things that is important too. Um, and so I'd be curious to hear both. Yeah. So if you have any other clues as to when you feel like you're more in the resistant state, or more the boundaried on that really like deeper level state, but then also the importance of boundaries and how you see that, and that that's really actually more authentic to be real with people,
Right.
to express our boundaries, and that's important. So kind of
Yeah.
talk about sort of,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
interesting. It's interesting that you say that. Specifically, like about the boundaries. I can remember, and I've had the same experiences with, yeah, encountering people who are homeless, and having interactions where it's like the labels kind of drop away, and it's not like, you know, me who has the food helping you who's needy and doesn't have any food. It's like, I'm Christ, you're Christ, and there's like this interaction where there's just as much holiness in the receiving as there in the giving. And it's like, thank you for allowing me to like bless you with the, you know what I mean? And like there's this very like joyful exchange. And then there's other times where, yeah, like I have felt um a clenching up in more of like a boundaried sense, where there's like that attunement to intuition, where I think kind of culturally, like we're missing this a little bit with the way that we like kind of label groups, and kind of put like, I don't know, like moral hierarchies based on like group identity and et cetera, et cetera. Where for me, it's more like if I was like blind and didn't know like what a person looked like, I often can kind of sense like the energy that that person is carrying, and that is your intuition, which is really like that is going to like guide you in your deepest wisdom. And so, if I'm looking at someone and I feel like some sort of hesitation about approaching or interacting with the person, and then I override that because I think, like I'm morally guilt tripping myself, I should be nice, or I shouldn't be afraid, or whatever, whatever. Well, that's where I'm like could get myself into trouble. I remember one time kind of just hiking with my kids, and um there, we were by ourselves like up on this mountain, and there was like someone passing us, and I think I kind of heard like my super ego kind of say um like you're silly for like judging this person kind of thing, or for kind of clenching up in fear, or like wanting to get away. And then there was this other part of me that's like, I just feel like on a really deep level that something doesn't feel right or safe here, and so like I'm detouring, and yeah, it's interesting what you're talking about, like with boundaries, where for me personally, I've had to kind of reacquaint myself with that deep part of myself that says like the answer is no, and I don't have an explanation for it. And that is a part that has always been like a very wise guide for me. And a lot of times, with certain people or situations in my life, it won't be till like years later where, you know, basically what I kind of felt off about will manifest in a really externally disastrous way. And it's like, I'm glad I did not override that internal guidance system.
Yeah.
Um, but to your other part, what was the first part of the question?
Uh, it was whether or not that's your main clue, that clenching feeling.
Oh, clenching, yes.
Is there, are
Okay.
there other clues, or how does that
Yeah, yeah,
feel
yeah.
to you that sort of lets you know,
Yes.
separate from the intuition and honoring our intuition and keeping our boundaries,
Yes.
that
Yeah,
let us know, because it's separate really from that lens, right? Being
that's
open on a
correct.
spiritual level to the lens and the full compassion and oneness with people.
Yes.
Yeah, when you know that that there's a
Yeah.
clue, like, okay, I'm in other lens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, that like lens of fear, it is like a clenching up, and a bracing for the worst where I kind of feel like I'm like recoiling from life, and sort of like just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sometimes I can go there with like current events or whatever, it's like, oh my gosh, this crazy thing is happening on the other side of the world, or this school shooting or whatever happened across that kind of thing, and I will start like catastrophizing, and it just starts feeling like, I don't know, like violence or harm is like kind of closing in on my consciousness. And then I'll start talking to my husband about like, what do we need to do to escape? And, do we need to move? And do we need to blah, 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 blah? And he's like, Heather, like you were fine a month ago. And then this one thing happened. And now you're going down that rabbit trail of like, we need to uproot our whole life and go somewhere else where you think it's going to be a utopia and it's not. And so not that when things like that happen, it's not like you don't kind of look out at the circumstances and go like, all right, maybe we do need to make an adjustment or something. But I can see sometimes when like an event or circumstance will happen, how there's like this contraction in my consciousness to like, um, yeah, everything's catastrophe and I need to escape. and so
Yeah.
I've And it's interesting, like you're saying, I can't really snap out of it voluntarily, but I can bring awareness to the fact that like I don't need to be making big decisions at this time
Yeah.
until I've like taken steps to like recalibrate the nervous system to like a place of calmness, where I
Yeah,
can be
right.
rational.
And that brings
Yeah.
in the practice. I mean, often there is some sort of practice involved, and
Yes.
then once that
Yeah.
realization happens,
Yeah,
uh,
but that contraction and that, like, tensing up, it's it is like a place of suffering, where even, like, I'll notice I won't eat. It's like my whole body is contracted in that way, and so it kinda just starts to invite, like, it starts to compound the suffering, like, even physically, my body will start to give me signals that it's like it's stressed and there's this constant adrenaline pumping and that's manifest, you know what I mean? And I'm like,
yes. Yeah.
okay.
This is reminding me, so it sounds like for you, it's nervous system regulation is really, really key.
Hmm.
I'm just curious. We're getting close to our time here, so before I ask, your very final words and how we can connect with you, is this could be about this kind of thing? It could be a totally separate practice. Is there any particular practice that you want to offer, just as a suggestion to people that they might want to try?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, certainly, like having a meditation practice has been really huge. Like I started out just using like the Calm app, which I got a subscription to, but there's like, there's free versions of it and lots of free apps like that where there's someone who's kind of like walking you through the process of, you know, calming your mind down. And so, I did that until I could kind of get to the point where I could just sort of drop into silence by myself. But something that is I'll give you just like sort of a funny story that ended up being like this accidental practice that I do. I went on this silent retreat one time, and it was like at a Catholic retreat center. And being like the naive little Protestant that I was, in Protestant churches, when you do communion, it's just, anyone who wants to come and take communion, come do it. Because we're just remembering what Jesus did for us. So I didn't know the rules for like Catholic Mass. And so I'm at this retreat, which was open to everyone, but there was like a Catholic Mass. And so when it was time for communion, I went up and like took the communion, even though I wasn't Catholic. And I didn't realize that that was like a big no-no in the Catholic religion. You have to be um, a Catholic and confirmed into the church or whatever. But I took it and I felt like this electricity like flow through my body. Like it felt, yeah, like I was just being like washed by Christ. Like it felt kind of euphoric and warm and wonderful. And so, and, having the new understanding that I had as like, Christ being the animating spirit flowing through creation, I totally understood the theology of it. It was like, no, I just drank Christ, and it's like, it's flowing through my body and it's transforming my DNA and, which is me becoming more like Christ. Like I understood all of it. But I didn't know the rules for the church. So at the end of this silent retreat, there was like a time for sharing, and I shared about this experience taking communion. And afterwards, there was sort of this old Catholic lady who, like wore the little decorated headscarf. And she came up and she was like, I, I'm just so certain that you made that priest so uncomfortable. And it was like this big shame thing. Like I had broken the rules and I had, you know, um, made the priests uncomfortable or whatever. And I just had this shame like wash over me. Like I felt so embarrassed that I had, you know, done it incorrectly and inadvertently caused discomfort. And so there was like one final mass, and I skipped it and went into this little chapel and just like cried. Like it was like this, yeah, this sense of feeling like really rejected and knowing that I had come like with a really pure heart and had sort of been like embarrassed by the stupid rules. And so afterwards, I was like, you know what? I went online and ordered myself like 500 of those little communion cups that they pass out in church, like there's like a wafer in communion or whatever. And so all the time now, like when I meditate or something, and I do this with my kids, and I love like my kids will come ask me for a pray cup now. And like instead of asking for something, we'll say, like, what do you want to feel in your heart today? And, my son might be like, I want to feel peace in my heart. And I'm like, me too, or whatever. And so we'll think about like the feeling of peace in our heart while we ingest the wafer and the juice. And it's like, it, it's, it has this effect of like just, ingesting peace. I don't know. I'll feel like this warmth, like my body is taking it all in and like becoming it, like becoming peace or becoming love or becoming joy. And so it's like the act of bringing your body into the practice of prayer through the eating and the drinking, which is the purpose of it. But it's just so funny how I kind of accidentally got to that because I was so angry that this lady
Yeah.
had shamed me for taking communion. But anyways, I'm not mad about it anymore. It's just a funny story. But it ended up being this wonderful thing where, like, my son will go get a pray cup and say, like, I want to do this.
I love that you shared that, both because that sounds like a wonderful practice to try, but also especially with the process that happened for you with it.
Mm-hmm.
I am
Yeah.
always encouraging people to really trust practices that do develop
Yeah.
organically from our own experiences, our own journeys. So I love that as a beautiful, rich example of that.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. So I guess just to end, I would love to hear, well, any final words you want to share, maybe like what you're hoping people will get from the book, and then how people can connect with you.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for having me on. The what I hope that people will get from the book is permission to explore, like, especially in the States, like we already have this spiritual language, like we already have this religion with like rich stories, rich texts, rich symbols, which unfortunately for so many people feel so triggering that they don't feel like that they can access anymore. And like what I really hope that by reading the book is that it would open up this whole new understanding of the text, sort of a metaphor of how this felt for me when I started to understand what myth was and to understand the symbolism and the metaphors and the stories was like, being in middle school band or something, we would always have to like play these really basic songs like Hot Cross Buns or something while we were just learning the instrument. And it got, I mean, you needed to do like the rudimentary stuff to learn the instrument, but it got really boring really fast, especially as you're like maturing and you're discovering like cooler music and you're like, I'd like to play this, but I'm still playing Hot Cross Buns. That's kind of what this felt like for me, where when I really understood the beauty in the symbolism, it was like hearing like Beethoven for the first time, or, my favorite band or something, or, like being at a concert with just like this beautiful music. And then, like, now when I hear people like bicker over the literal interpretations of the Bible, like, it feels like they're arguing over like hot cross buns or the ABCs or something like that. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like it's just, I don't know. Like, I feel like that it helped me so much overcome a lot of like the triggering and the religious trauma that a lot of people, experience still trying to interact with the text because they're interacting with it in a way that it wasn't meant, like it wasn't written for that. And so I'm hoping that like that can be set aside and people can like re-engage with this in a way that like um I don't know, invigorates the imagination and fuses it with like beauty and art and possibility and this deep, deep understanding of who you actually are. For me, that's what's most interesting about the stories. And so I my goal with the book was to get people who, whether they accept the literalism or reject the literalism, either side of that coin, to just put the literalism aside and like open up this new portal for interacting with the text.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I will definitely put both the contact information that you share and give us in a moment here and the name of the book again so everyone can find it in the description box and the notes for the podcast.
Yeah, and yeah, to your point about contacting, yeah, so the book is Returning to Eden. Um, you can find it on Amazon or wherever books are sold. And my website is returningtoeden.com. I have just a monthly newsletter called Unorthodox. And actually, if you sign up, you can read the introduction for free, which is the introduction is basically my mystical experience. So you can read about that for free. And then on social media, I'm Heather Hamilton 1 and then Heather Hamilton Author on Facebook. And this
Great.
is our and this is my youngest Florence. She ran out of patience to wait.
That's all right. We went a little over. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Thank you so much, Heather, for being with us today.
So, thanks so much for having me.